Well, good afternoon. I'm Sergio Pellegrino. I'm a professor at Galset, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Cynthia Sung, who is an assistant professor at UPenn. And she is a mechanical engineer that went into electrical engineering and computer science for his PhD to work with her advisor at MIT, Professor Daniela Raz. Now, Cynthia works on computational methods to design robotic systems, and her particular approach is focused on origami and compliant robots. She is also involved in the fabrication of devices, and there is a lot of fun in our lab. Now, one thing I would like to mention is a particularly significant award that she received very recently, and that is Johnson & Johnson 2020 award for women and STEM, and it actually comes also with money for her research. So congratulations for that award, and we are very pleased to host you today and hear about your work. So Dr. Sung, please go ahead with your seminar. And
Right,
I'll just mention that just a practical thing, apologies for interrupting. We will not be able to take questions at the end, but if you send messages on the chat, we will ask questions at the end. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sergio, for the nice introduction. And thanks to all of you who have come to this virtual seminar. I'm really excited to share the work that my group's doing on origami-inspired robots. So to begin, origami. A lot of you have probably folded as a child or even now as a hobby. Origami is an ancient art of folding. It's been around for centuries and is generally thought of as an artistic expression, right? How do you take a sheet of paper, crease it in certain ways, get it to turn into some sort of interesting 3D object? So what you're seeing here is just a video of me folding a very traditional pattern. This is the flapping crane, and it's generally one of the icons that people think of when they think about origami. Now, what's interesting about this is that origami is not just an art. There's a lot of mathematics and geometry behind it. So if we think about what actually went into creating this 3D shape and all of the creases that were placed on the paper, we can think about unfolding the paper, and what we end up with something like this. So this piece of paper started out as a square. We added in folds, and this network of folds together created the 3D object on the left. From the point of view of robotics, we're also interested in origami as a potential fabrication or assembly approach. What you're seeing here are examples of origami robots that people in different labs have created. And in general, the folding of a thin sheet of material can give you a robot that's very lightweight, uses established manufacturing processes, so it's cheap and fast to produce. And what's nice is that you can get integrated actuation and sensing. So a lot of these robots here make use of the ability of folds to move in order to continue to get the robot to move even after it's achieved its final 3D shape. So in my group, we're interested in understanding what are the underlying design principles for making these sorts of origami-inspired machines, because it seems like there's a lot of interesting geometry, kinematics, and mechanics that goes into turning a 2D sheet of something into a 3D sheet. And there's also a lot of potential for making interesting robotic devices from these materials. So, as I said, my group works on these basic 3D questions: geometry, how do we create different shapes? Kinematics, how do we create different motions, because these are robots? And mechanics, how do we enable these robots to actually exert forces? So I'm going to take you through some of the ideas that we've been thinking about in each of these 3 questions today, and hopefully give you some intuition or exposure to the ways that we think about these types of problems. So in terms of geometry, this is really the question of what kinds of shapes then can you create using folding. And actually in this space, there's been a lot of work in both from the artist community, but also in computational geometry. A lot of people have thought about, well, if you have a general 3D shape, doesn't need to move at all, what is the crease pattern associated with it? And there have even been software tools that have been developed. You can just download them offline and input a 3D mesh and it'll spit out a fold pattern for you. A lot of the modeling that undergoes these sorts of approaches looks like this. We can actually model an origami pattern as a mechanism. So a lot of you build your own mechanisms and structures. So I'm sure you have thought about these sorts of rigid body linkages and combinations of joints and links before, right? Origami is exactly the same. So here I can basically model a crease in a piece of paper as a hinge, as a rotational joint. In this case, if I assume that the origami pattern is rigid everywhere except joints, then I get this rigid face here, this triangle, which is going to rotate about this blue line compared to this other triangle on the pattern. So if I wanted to write this a little bit more formally, then what I could do is label my crease here as CI. This is going to be both the axis of rotation and the location of the crease on the pattern. And now if I want to track the positions of points on the pattern, then I can say that the 3D location of a point P relative to Q is going to be some rigid body rotation about the crease line CI by the fold angle, right? And so this is a interesting way that you can model these origami patterns as rigidly foldable objects. And when you have a network of creases, as you do in this pattern here, then you can compose different rotations with each other in order to track the 3D shape of the pattern as it folds from its flat state. Of course, when you do this, this is actually a parallel mechanism. And so it's subject to certain constraints. In particular, if you have a loop of creases here, then the product over all of your rotations over the creases in this loop has to be identity so that you don't have any weird twisting of the paper. But if you follow all of these rules, then you have a very nice mathematical description of what happens to an origami fold pattern. And so using these sorts of models, people have been able to generate algorithms for converting 3D shapes into 2D fold patterns. This is an example here of one. It's the Origamizer developed by Tomohiro Tachi in 2010. And in this work, he showed that you can take really an arbitrary polyhedral surface and turn it into a 2D pattern. And if you're willing to put enough work into folding the thing, then eventually you can demonstrate that this 2D fold pattern actually does fold into this 3D surface. So this is great because it means that really you can make any shape out of origami that you want. But as a roboticist, I want to take a closer look at what the output of this sort of algorithm is. What you're seeing here is a close-up of the crease pattern that comes out of the Origamizer. And we start seeing in the pattern, well, we can see in the pattern the exact approach that was taken to create it. So generally what happens in this algorithm is we take one face on the surface and then we map it to a face on the pattern. And then we spread out all of the faces enough so that they don't overlap with each other, then tuck away all the extra material. So all of these white triangles here are faces that are actually on the surface of this bunny in its folded shape. And all of the gray material here is material that gets tucked away in order to turn this square paper into the bunny shape. And so from the point of view of robotic fabrication, these algorithms don't really give us exactly what we want because they waste a lot of material, which makes the device more heavy. It also makes it harder to assemble. And since these robots have to interact with the environment and sometimes get damaged, it also makes it more difficult to replace later. So replace certain parts later. So in my lab, we've been thinking about, well, are there alternate ways we can approach the origami design process so that we can think about more practical ways of building origami-inspired robots, but still be able to achieve all of the complexities that a robot might need. And one of the approaches we've been thinking about is composition. So to put it in the context of this example, say, for example, this was the bunny that we wanted to create. The Origamizer is going to output a static statue, but let's say we want the ears to move, so we want them to be something, a separate piece. Well, it would be nice if we could cut up this model and maybe make separate patterns for the body versus the ears and somehow compose them together later. More generally, the approach that we've been thinking about for origami-inspired design is this idea of design composition. In particular, many labs around the world have created many, many designs for origami-inspired robots. And this can go into a library that, that we can use in order to create more advanced robots in the future. So when we think about this library of designs, we can associate each of them with a high-level representation. And this representation includes information about geometry, about degrees of freedom, parameters that you can change in order to manipulate the design. And so now if you want to create a new design, well, we can map parts of this design to parts in the library. So I can say, for example, that these fingers look very close to the fingers on this gripper here. Maybe I want the design to have a telescoping base, so I can map it to this worm robot that's already in the database. And because each of the designs in the database is associated with a real origami robot and fold pattern and fabrication plan, then I can very quickly convert this conceptual design into a physical design as well. So the questions in this approach that we need to answer then are, what exactly goes into this library? What is it that we need in order to create robots with the types of abilities that we want, the types of functionality that we care about? And also, if we really want to do this approach of composing different designs from a database together, are there methods that we can use in order to guarantee that those compositions will work? So, so this is how we're thinking about the problem. From the point of view of designs, we already covered the question about shapes. We know that rigid bodies can be created. And so what I'm primarily interested then is how can we create joints to enter into this library, this library of designs. So if we're trying to create this library, then the first thing to think about is what exactly a fold is, right? And as we said, a fold is a hinge. So if I take a thin sheet of plastic and I put a crease down the middle, then I get two flaps that are rotate relative to each other. What this means is that, as you might expect, if you take a strip of material and you add multiple folds into it, you get a mechanism, you get a linkage, right? So here is a very simple example. I take a strip of paper, add 3 folds, close the loop, and I get a 4-bar linkage, right? Which has coupled, horizontal, and vertical translation. Now, I can make this structure more complex, so I can add more layers to it. In this case, if I put 2 layers on it, I can decouple my horizontal translation, my vertical translation. And in this case, I can get a range of motion that depends on the dimensions of the 4-bar itself, but also the number of layers that I've composed together. All right. What's nice is that I can map this exact mechanism directly to a fold pattern. So if I start then with the original 4-bar, I can map it to this strip unfolding here. This is the solid line is the boundary. All these dotted lines are folds. So you can see how this rectangular strip folds directly into this 4-bar on the left. And if I want to add more columns to the structure, make it more stiff, make it more rigid, I can do that by updating the fold pattern. And I can do this as many times as I want. If I want to add more rows to this structure to increase the range of motion, I can do that as many times as I want. And this is all based on the idea that each of these folds then is a rotational hinge that has a free degree of freedom, right? Which is the fold angle. And so I can now construct these parameterized joints that I can leverage in my robot designs, which allow me to get translational motion with a range of motion that I can specify. All right, and just to prove that this pattern here does indeed fold into the lattice of 4x linkages, this is the folded shape here, all animated according to these rigid body kinematics that I described at the beginning. This isn't the only way you can build kinematic structures out of origami. I can also change the shapes here. I can change what these, where the locations of these revolute joints are. So if I, instead of using a bunch of rectangles, I use trapezoids, for example, I can instead build a spherical 4x linkage. I can play the same game of connecting all of these pieces together. In this case, instead of getting a translational joint, I get one which has coupled vertical motion with twisting, and I can again stack these on top of each other in order to get an arbitrary range of motion. So using these sorts of approaches, we can start to compose joints that are useful in robot designs. Now, what I've just shown you are two examples. We have a translational joint right here in the middle. We have a rotational joint on the right. If we were in person, I'd pass these around and you could play with them yourselves. It's actually pretty fun, but unfortunately, you'll have to make do with the video. But these two form the two basic types of joints that most robots use, right? And since all motion can really be broken down to be a combination of rotation and translation, then if we can figure out this composition issue, then we have some guarantee that we can create some robots that are extremely complex. Now, that's not to say that these are the joints that you would eventually want to use in a robot, but that means that those types of robots are possible. So when we're thinking about composition, then the question becomes, well, can we make any kind of robotic structure? Can we make any kind of kinematic structure, right? And the result that we want is that you can create any robot through folding. Now, to get to this sort of result, we've been thinking about particular types of compositions. I'm not going to get into all of the details here, but I will give you a basic overview of how we think about this problem. So the composition problem that we've been looking at is this. This is given two unfoldings and an edge on each. In this case, we have a square, which has a corresponding Latin cross unfolding, and this green edge highlighted on both the 3D shape and the unfolding. Then we want to figure out a way to combine the two different fold patterns together along that edge, basically gluing the two fold patterns together at that edge, without changing the original fold patterns themselves. This allows us to just directly use anything in our library of origami designs, and also gives us the ability to map back parts, or to directly see a mapping between parts of a fold pattern and parts of a robot. So in this case, in this drawing here, the solution is not too complicated. You take this pattern on the right, flip it around, glue the two patterns together at these green edges, and you're done. You have two cubes stuck together. The problem appears when you have different edges or more complicated fold patterns. So let's say, for example, that I chose this edge instead. Well, if I tried to do the same thing and just glue these two edges together, I'd end up with some self-intersection of the final fold pattern. And that's not okay when we're designing an origami pattern, because we're supposed to fold the whole thing out of a single flat sheet, right? So we were able to determine that it is possible to create a one-piece non-self-intersecting edge composition of two folded surfaces in polynomial time, and actually using a polynomial amount of wasted material. And to give you some of the intuition behind this, it's all based on convex hulls. So when we think about fold patterns, at least in my group, we think a lot about what does the convex hull of this pattern look like. So the main insight here is that if you have two patterns that you're trying to glue together, and the edges that you're trying to join are on the convex hulls of these patterns, then you can just directly glue these two patterns together. And this is because for two convex shapes, or for a convex shape, that shape is guaranteed to lie entirely on one side of the line through an edge on that shape. So if we draw a red line through the edge we're joining, one pattern is guaranteed to lie entirely on one side, the other pattern is guaranteed to lie entirely on the other side. The patterns themselves are not changed at all. And so if we were to fold this composition, we get back the original pieces that from the original fold patterns themselves, just joined along that green edge. Now, if the edges that you want to join are not on the boundaries of the convex hull, that's when you end up with some issues, some possible self-intersections. But we've demonstrated that in this case, it's possible to add some extra material using the same tucking away strategy, which creates new edges that are on the boundary of the convex hull, these new green edges here, that you can now join together without worrying about self-intersection. These bridges are added in such a way that when you fold just the bridge itself, then those new edges that you've added fold directly onto the edges that you originally wanted to join. And as a result, the final 3D shape of the pattern is exactly the same as the 3D shape you wanted, except you have this extra wasted material here, which is tucked up against the surface of the fold pattern. So this is at least some guarantee that we can compose patterns from a database of robot parts together. Since then, we've been taking a look at what are optimizations you can put on top of this sort of approach. This is not always going to give you the best composition, but it will give you one. And so you can look at further improvements, such as shortening the bridge or looking at alternative edges that you can join together in order to make your composition better for whatever fabrication approach it is that you're taking. So based on this result, then, we now know that if you are able to create a library of parts that give you the types of joint motions that you want in a robot, then combine that with approaches such as the Origamizer that allow you to generate arbitrary rigid bodies, you can compose them together into robots with arbitrary kinematics. And so this here is an example of one of the robots that we've composed. What you're seeing down here is exactly the revolute joint that I showed you before. Up here is a sequence of hinges that form some sort of 4-bar linkage. In the lab, we call this the penguin because it kind of has that motion. But this entire robot can be folded out of a single sheet with holes in it. And the pattern is shown on the left. Now, what I really like about this approach is that, again, you can map parts of your fold pattern directly onto the robot. So this joint down here, this one that's rotating, is this section of the fold pattern right here, right? This 4-bar linkage on top is this section of the robot right here, right? And so now we can start to see exactly where different parts of the robots are formed, and we can modify only those sections of the robot if we need to iterate over the design. Now, people sometimes ask me, why did we go through all this trouble? Because I could have just made this joint and then glued them together or figured out some way to connect them together later. And that's true. If you don't want to go through the complexity of folding all those extra bridging material, then you just connect the two separate pieces together. In our case, we were particularly interested in whether this result was possible from the point of view of laying electronics, actuations, and sensing directly onto the robot body. So in this case, what you're seeing in the black traces here are the circuitry that are on the robot body. We put them, we etch the circuit onto the plastic right after cutting it out, but before folding. And this allowed us to, or this creates the possibility that you might be able to just place electronic components on your robot using standard pick and place methods without having to worry about how the circuit is going to look in 3D. And so, for example, to give you a close-up, this is the circuit that is in this section of the robot right here, and it was etched directly onto this portion of the robot right here. So now we have our motor soldered directly into the circuitry on the robot body and a potentiometer for sensing as well. So all of this is to say then that if we want to create complex robots with complex kinematic structures, that's possible according to these sorts of geometrical approaches and these algorithms. So when we're thinking about where the limits of these types of origami robots are, kinematically at least, it seems that the limitations are not quite so bad. So it is possible to make very, very interesting robotic structures using just origami, even potentially as interesting as robots you might make through traditional manufacturing methods. There is one caveat though, which is when you take a look at these robots, what you'll see is that many of them are quite small. Most of them are not really carrying high payloads. And a lot of the papers that you read about them will explicitly tell you that there was some warping of the pattern or some flexibility that was not modeled and not expected, which caused the robot to perhaps not perform in the same way it was modeled, right? And that's because when we were modeling these patterns, we assumed that the faces were perfectly rigid. We assumed that the creases were perfect rotational hinges, but in reality, they're not, right? And so if I want to take any of the structures that I showed you before and measure their force displacement curves, I can do that. And what I'll find is that the folds in a fold pattern actually act very much like springs, right? So here, if I increase the fold angle, then I get a larger restoring torque. And when I combine a lot of folds together into a complicated structure like this, then the force displacement relationship also becomes fairly complex, right? So because there are these reaction forces in the folds, right? And because the sheet itself is also fairly compliant, what that means is that if you want to look at a physical version of these joints that I showed you, they're going to be extra degrees of freedom. Right? So even if we compose a new robot, did we freeze? Okay.
Your camera is working fine. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. It looked like we froze for a minute. So even if we compose a robot, if we wanted to carry any kind of payload, then it's not necessarily going to act the way we want it to. So here's an example of us trying to do the same experiment where we composed a camera mount this time. I put my smartphone on it. The smartphone is basically as heavy as the robot itself, and there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of vibration in this thing. It's not working the way you would want the camera mount to. So we could say, oh, let's take advantage of that. That's awesome. Let's make some very soft robots, some interesting structures, and leverage the flexibility of these folds in order to create interesting, in this case, animatronics. So that's one of the things we did. We sliced different 3D models and figured out what the reaction of these sliced models were going to be based on an energy analysis. And if you do this properly, you can even string tendons through the entire structure to actuate the structure in a way to get it to move in the way you want. If you want to put other optimization approaches on it too, you can end up with an end-to-end system where you can put in a 3D mesh, specify what motions you want this mesh to have, and then get out of it the tendon locations and the fold pattern that allows your mesh to move in some interesting and very interesting ways that are possible only because of the compliance of the structure. And in this case, the patterns are necessarily soft so that we can get these interesting motions. But in a lot of cases in robotics, we don't actually want to have patterns this soft, right? And so the real question is, can we actually get to the other end of the spectrum, right? Can we still get the benefits of lightweight origami? Can we still have the manufacturing advantages but be able to create structures that can carry loads and can do some sort of work in the way more traditionally manufactured robots can. So one easy answer is, well, you can just take the same pattern and make it out of a different material. And so we did that too. And so you can make the whole thing out of aluminum, and you can show that the same fold pattern you designed for a small robot also works for a big robot. And that's fine. But it's not, we weren't entirely satisfied with that approach, because that means then that the performance of your robot is also going to be highly dependent on your material choice. And the origami pattern itself is perhaps not particularly relevant. And so we wondered whether there was a way for us to increase the robustness of an origami design through the pattern itself. To do this, we were inspired by what's called the Bellows theorem. The Bellows theorem says that the volume of a polyhedron with rigid faces is invariant under flexing. And so practically what that means is that, let's say that you fold a shape that looks like this, and you can imagine that there are caps on the top and the bottom. If you want to compress this shape and change the volume inside of this shape, then the faces also have to change shape, right? And so so in that case, you either maintain rigid foldability assumptions and then the whole thing is locked, or you acknowledge that the faces are going to deform a bit and use that to your advantage in order to create tunably stiff origami structures. So here's an example of what that might look like in this case. This is exactly this pattern that we see here, but it has multiple layers. Each of these layers here is theoretically locked, but because of the compliance of a face, because it's allowed to bend, you can apply some force to the structure and get it to deform. And for this particular structure, once you exceed a certain threshold, then it also experiences snap through. So we can create models of these sorts of structures. We can model them as these networks of springs, predict their behavior, compare them to their true behavior in real life, and see that, yes, it is the case that depending on what your fold pattern looks like, you can get a lot of different mechanical behaviors out of a bellows-like structure. So what you're seeing on the right here is then the force displacement curves for this design right here, but with different angles alpha. Alpha is the angle between this diagonal crease and this horizontal crease on the pattern, and it controls the slope angle of the 3D folded shape. And so it would make sense that by changing alpha, you change the slope of the cone here in this bellows structure, and you can change the stiffness of the design. But what I like about this is that alpha is a fold pattern parameter, right? And so we can directly now map fold pattern parameters to mechanical behavior without, well, directly to mechanical behavior. So my master's student got very excited about this, and she said, well, that's really interesting because now we basically have a tunable origami spring. So can we use this to make a new type of origami jumper? If we take a look at the force displacement curves, then if you compress the robot and you release it, that the integral under the curve is going to be the energy that you get that release when the thing is decompressed, and potentially the energy you get back from jumping. So can we create really interesting origami robots that use the fold pattern itself in order to create the jumping or the dynamic motion? So, so she did that. She took this exact pattern here, which I showed you on the previous slide, put in some actuators, battery microcontroller, and put on a very simple controller. The controller just says, pull on a piece of string that connects the bottom of the robot to the top of the robot. And whenever you hit a certain angle, which is specified by this latching mechanism that she designed, then release. And when you do that, then you can get these robots that jump. All right. Compared to other origami robots out there, this one is different because the jumping behavior and the energy is stored directly into the fold pattern itself. A lot of times when you see origami used to make lightweight robots, it's used as a structural element. And so a lot of jumping robots out there will add additional springs or something or latches in order to get a robot to jump. But in this case, the body of the robot, the fold pattern itself, which accounted for only 7 grams of the full robot mass, was what was responsible for the jumping behavior. And the nice thing is that even with the same controller, if you change the parameters of the design itself, then you can get different jumping heights. So what your controller is embedded into the origami design, and the controller itself that you program onto the microcontroller can be extremely simple. So we got very excited about this and thought, well, are there other areas where we can use these sorts of ideas in order to create robots that actually need to exert non-insignificant forces? This has been, I would say, a gap in origami robotics, because typically when people create these designs and don't take the flexibility of the film into account, then the robots just aren't able to exert those loads. So I showed this work to Dan Kodacek, who's another professor at Penn, and his group specializes in these legged robots that you see on the slide. These robots are very good at running and jumping and locomoting over all sorts of terrain. They're extremely stable. And the reason for this is that they put on these robots what's called a Rayburn style controller, where they assume that the legs are these massless springs. And so the mass of the robot is assumed to be in the body of the robot itself. The legs are springs. And then by controlling the touchdown angle and the compression length of the springs, then you can get these robots to run, jump over all sorts of terrain. The challenge with these sorts of robots is that how you can get them to actually match these massless spring assumptions. And so what you're seeing in here is the approach that his lab took, which is to use this sort of 4-bar mechanism in order to keep the legs low mass and put the spring-like behavior into the motor itself. But we thought, well, why not just use origami-inspired design to directly create this spring-like leg with negligible mass? So in a collaborative project, Wei Shi was the leading student here. We took a more careful look at these origami springs and to figure out whether we could get them to create the same amount of power or to transmit the same amount of power that Dan usually creates or uses in his legged robots. In this case, you don't want any snap through. That's easy. You just double layer the whole origami pattern, add geometric constraints to make sure that it actually has normal spring-like motion. And then by looking at different parameters for the origami design, we can figure out what stiffnesses these designs are actually capable of. So Wei Shi folded all of these patterns. He and another student, Arden, generated these really nice force displacement curves, which demonstrated that with these patterns, you can get stiffness relationships that are basically linear in fold pattern parameters. And the stiffnesses of these structures can actually be quite high. Now, for these legged robots, I at least the one that we eventually made, the body itself was about 1 kilogram. And what that meant was the leg needed to have a stiffness on the order of 3 kilonewtons per meter. And so based on these results, we were able to figure out that if you combine a couple of these origami springs together, we can actually achieve the same types of motion that that Dan Kotichek's group worked so hard to get in their more rigid mechanisms. An interesting thing is that Arden also spent some time doing a lot of cyclic testing on these structures. And it turns out that these structures are actually quite reliable. So even though origami patterns for this robot were folded out of just regular poster board, they can undergo something like 2,000 cycles and not see too much change in their behavior after the first cycle. So based on this, we made this jumping one-legged robot. And this robot here, you can see a close-up of the leg area. It uses 3 of these bellows springs with stiffness tuned to total 3 kilonewtons per meter. On this robot is just the standard controller that their group uses on any of their other legged robots. And we get the same type of behavior where you get very nice control of the jumping height and forward velocity using the exact same controllers. So these robots now have gone through hundreds of jumping cycles, and the origami patterns are still alive. Actually, what's funny is the part that broke first was the toe down here. It was experiencing way too much friction with the ground, and it melted. But the spring part of the leg is completely fine. And so these patterns have the ability to withstand quite a bit of abuse and transmit even up to 25 watts of power on these legged robots. So where are we going with this project in the future? What we're really interested in now is whether we can actually tune the behavior of the pattern on the fly. So for these legged robots, it's well known that the stiffness of the leg and the damping of the leg has a huge effect on the efficiency of locomotion. And because we can map these parameters directly back to fold pattern geometry, we can think about ways that we can tune the stiffness through local geometry changes. So my student Shivangi has been taking a look at what this mapping looks like. You can model these structures as, again, networks of springs and end up with these pretty standard force moment relationships, which allow you to derive bulk stiffnesses for the design. These equations are fully differentiable. So now we can go back and create controllers that allow us to modify the stiffness in real time in order to get the bulk mechanical properties that are needed for a legged robot. So what that means is that now, potentially in future legged robots, you could still have the same very simple high-level controller and then have more local distributed control on the robot itself to adjust for any types of changes that are needed for the robot on a specific terrain. So what you're seeing here is the output of that controller. The thickness of the lines here is the stiffness in a particular segment. And this one here is tuned to achieve a particular touchdown angle so that the robot doesn't need to actuate that on its own as it's running around. We think that this is possible because we've, in another branch of work, which I haven't talked about today, we've been investigating ways of embedding actuation directly into a fold pattern. So we know that if you embed active materials onto a fold pattern itself, then you can get it to react to certain signals such as heat or light or magnetism. And we think we can use these same sorts of fabrication approaches as a mechanism to change the geometry of the fold pattern and get these sorts of real-time stiffness changes on these robots in the future. So that was about getting these origami patterns to be useful in dynamical robots and survive large amounts of abuse. I thought because of this audience, I might also take a little bit of time at the end of my talk to show you one of our newer works in progress, which is only really tangentially related to origami design, but I think you might find it interesting. So in another branch of work, we're looking at how we can also take advantage of mechanism design and compliant mechanisms and morphing in order to create more efficient aerial vehicles. One of my students, Jessica, was very inspired by this video, which came out last year, where a quadrotor is able to bend its arms in order to squeeze through a tiny space. In this case, the quadrotor's arms just have springs in them. So when the robot accelerates at a certain rate due to inertia, then the arms fold in, and when the robot slows down, then the arms fold back out. But she was thinking that it might be interesting to use that ability for a quadrotor to morph to get it to switch between different flight modes. So the concept is on the right here. It's a quadrotor that can fold out wings in order to turn into a fixed wing aircraft. And in this case, that change between the two different modes is controlled by the trajectory of the robot, how much thrust it's applying at a particular amount of time, and the inertia of different parts of the robot relative to each other. So together with Chen-Fan Fujiang, who is an assistant professor in graphics at the University of Pennsylvania, we put together a dynamic simulation and optimization for this sort of robot. What you're seeing here is the resulting design, which we just submitted to ICRA. And down here, you're going to see the robot moving in the global frame. And up here, you're going to see the robot morphing in its own local frame. So what happens is that this bar here is basically a bistable beam. And this box right here is the electronics and battery, which has most of the weight of the robot. When the robot accelerates forward, then that creates forces on the body of the robot, which allow it to either snap up or down into different modes and get the wing segments, which are these bars on the left and right, to either fold in or out. This whole structure is extremely complex and not something we would have wanted to design by hand. So in the end, we ended up formulating a topology optimization to design the compliant mechanism for us. So in this case, the goal is to maximize the probability of having some sort of snap through in the vehicle while limiting the amount of force that it's needed to snap from one mode to another, and also keeping the entire structure within a certain volume or below a certain weight. So my student built this structure. You can see the results here on a boom, and we are able to show that this aerial vehicle is able to morph from one state to another just by applying thrust at the propellers. So this is it morphing from the quadrotor mode to fixed wing mode and then back. We also attached wings to this thing And here you can see my student doing handheld experiments. We unfortunately were still limited in our access to all of our lab facilities at the time. So she just did it by hand. But you can see on the left and right that when she accelerates the vehicle using just her arms, and so these are not very precise controllers at all, we are able to get the wings to also fold in and fold out. To bring this back to the topic of the talk then, this wing design also required us to very much think about the stiffness of the fold pattern as it applied to these flying vehicles. Because typically with a rigidly foldable design, you might think that this simple fan design is fine and would fold out perfectly well. But because all of the patterns that we're creating are made of compliant materials, that wing design was just not useful in this context because it was just flapping around too much. So we ended up having to take similar approaches as what we did for legged robots and stiffen the wings by adding angular defects, by using non-flat surfaces, and eventually it got this nice design, which was more stiff. So you might be wondering whether the final vehicle actually flies. This, like I said, actually flies. Like I said, this is a work in progress. So my student did try to get it to transition, but we're unfortunately currently limited in space. And she wasn't able to actually execute the control maneuver that was necessary to get it to fully transition. You can see the wings kind of came out at the end of that video there. So we're currently going through the process of finding another space or somewhere where we can do more controlled flight experiments to make sure that everything works the same way in 3D as it did in simulation and as it did on our one-dimensional boom. So you can be on the watch for that. So in conclusion then, I hope that you were able to learn something about origami-inspired robotics. Again, our lab is very interested in design principles for how you can get reconfigurable robots through shape change, through interesting robot kinematics, and more recently in how we can get these robots to actually carry loads and do work under, in sometimes very punishing situations, such as legged robots or aerial flight. All of this work was done by my lab members, both human and non-human, and I'm also grateful to my collaborators and funding agencies and happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was very